Thank you once more. I do appreciate this opportunity to share various bits of work that I have done over the last few decades. Um, I hope it's only a sign of the long weekend coming up that the interest in workers is showing some diminution. But compared with the numbers we had earlier, but that's fine. I'm taking this opportunity to also share with you a few clips from a film I made on KGF in 1997, or almost 30 years ago, when the mines were about to close. So with your permission, just to give you a sense of that darkness and the very little light that existed underground, I would like to share this first clip. Um,
Belt up. Belt up. Onadi. Sorry, no,
So yeah, I start today's lecture too with the actual event, which begins on April 1st, 1930, when an anonymous notice was found attached to a rock in Kolar Gold Field, urging the mining coolies, hand jumpers, mud coolies, and surface coolies to stop registering themselves under a new system that the company John Taylor and Sons had introduced, which required them to provide their fingerprints. An 18,000 strong workforce decided to oppose this new registration system introduced by the company because in the previous year, that is in 1929, Mysore had passed what was called a Workmen's Compensation Act. And the company claimed that in order to fulfill obligations under the Workmen's Compensation Act, it needed to register all workers and to be able to identify them. Now, by the time this call to not cooperate with registration was given in this anonymous notice, about 7,000 miners had already given their fingerprints. Until then, there had been a system of identification which is referred to as the Bertillon system of identification, which did not include fingerprints. And I'll come to that in just a minute. But the notices, the anonymous notices which sprang up in different parts of this 75 square mile area were asking workers to simply stop work from April 8th until the new registration system was withdrawn. Now, so the rest of the story that I am going to discuss with you is why the workers unanimously protested this new system of registration, and what were the other kinds of issues that came up in the course of this demand for not cooperating with registration that emerged. What were the demands made by workers on the management? Now, in order to answer this question, we have to go back a little bit to the history of the mines itself. I would like to just do a very thumbnail sketch of Kolar Gold Fields and the kind of mobilization of workers that had happened since the 1880s, when it began functioning as a profit-making enterprise in the Champion, when the Champion lode was discovered. There were about 5,000 or 6,000 workers in the late 1880s. But by 1907, there were 36,000 workers who were working in the Kolar Gold Fields, over 4 different mines. So these are the mines, the Champion Reef. The figure in brackets is telling you the depth to which it went by by the 1930s. I'll come back to why the depth question is very relevant. Nandidurg, Balaghat, Urgaon, which went down to 8,000 feet, and Mysore mines. Of course, by the time that I'm talking about, which is 1930, the numbers had dropped considerably to about 18,000, which was still a very large figure. It was the largest enterprise in the old Mysore state. Of course, the one other aspect that needs to be emphasized here is that the company had a hard time right from the outset managing this space and actually managing this very large workforce, because, as you know, the product of the mines was gold. The temptations to actually take away the amalgam or gold quartz and so on was very strong. So they had a very strict set of regulations to govern this region. And in my work, in my book, I have actually described it as a company state, because in some ways, the company was the state in this particular region. The state government did not have much to say or do in terms of the regulations that were operating in KGF. Among the strictest rules that was put in place were the Mysore Mines Regulation of 1906, which developed, really speaking, a new taxonomy of crime itself. So all those were punished who were in possession of any form of unwrought gold. There had to be a very strict system of licenses for traders and merchants in the area. And importantly, and we'll come back to this as well a little later, there was a strict ban on a certain category of people who were called undesirable. For the most part, the term undesirable was used to describe, thieves, scoundrels of that kind. But as we will see, it also included later on, by about the 1920s, when the national movement is slowly taking shape and is able to exert itself even in areas like KGF, it includes nationalist figures who were called disorganizers of labor. So not organizers of labor, but disorganizers of labor. So there were very strict rules which actually prevailed in this particular set of mines. And of course, as I said, in my work, it is interesting that even in such a repressive system, it was possible for workers to find worth and meaning in this area, a new sense of self-worth and new sense of meaning, partly because many of them had migrated from the extremely dry districts of Chengalpat and Salem, North Arcot, and so on, where they had been, in many cases, bonded labor. So for them, the opportunity to work in the mines was more like a sense of freedom. Money spelt liberty. So money wages was actually a form of, liberation, as it were. I'm giving you all this background because you have to understand why it is they reacted so strongly and even threatened to start walking back to their homes if this new system of registration continued. What they demanded, so I'll come to Mysore Criminal Tribes Act. So in addition to the Mysore Mines Regulation of 1906, you also had, from 1916, the operation of what is called the Mysore Criminal Tribes Act, which was exclusively operating only in KGF, identified these 5 sets of tribes, Gantichors, Cape Maris, Wadars, Korachars, and Koravas, as criminal tribes, and therefore placed them under forms of surveillance which were extremely pervasive and obnoxious. As it was in many parts of India, but in Mysore, it was only applicable to the KGF area. Wadars are very essential to the mining operation because they are the experts in actually digging They are the well diggers. They have those skills in actually digging, and so therefore they are very essential to mine life. So you needed them, but you needed to keep an eye on them. So the Wadars, for instance, under the Criminal Tribes Act, they were expected to be physically examined. All their orifices were examined, from mouth to anus to vagina, and they had to simply subject themselves to this kind of examination if they wanted to continue to labor in this region. I'm just giving you, as I said, a sense of the kind of elements of oppression, surveillance and oppression that prevailed in this area, even at the time that we are talking about. Now, many judges and authorities in the Mysore government felt that these kinds of restrictions were necessary because, as Judge Muller said, the theft of gold in small quantities was doubly criminal because the offenses are committed by regularly paid coolies or other workmen who are employed by the owners of the property stolen. So there is a double sort of criminality that shadows this worker in this area. So there were, as I said, extraordinary levels of surveillance in the mines. But I would like to move forward to say a few things about conditions of work in the mines, without which, again, we cannot understand this particular event or episode. So let me talk at first about the distinction between the company and the contract coolies. Only a proportion of workers in the mines worked directly and were paid by the John Taylor and Sons. Most of the other workers, close to about 55%, were provided by contractors, which meant that they were not directly paid by John Taylor and Sons, and their work lives were therefore much more precarious. And the saying in that region, there are, by the way, wonderful sayings that came up as a consequence of the self-deprecation and the wit of the Tamilian laborer. Karude mechalam, company ki mekinam, which means even if you graze a donkey, you must graze it for the company. You shouldn't, try to be employed by the contract labor. So the company was definitely the preferred employer because it was fixed hours, it was, fixed wages, and so on and so forth. Contract workers, for example, could work double shifts, and in some cases, because there was so much self-exploitation, they could even work 3 shifts. And this led to, as you can imagine, exhaustion underground. So, KGF had an extraordinarily high degree of accidents that happened as a consequence of exertion of a kind that we are seeing at very, very low depths. I'm coming back to the figures that I showed you earlier about the depths to which these mines went. They were among the deepest mines in the world. Urgam went down to 8,000 feet, which is more than about 2.5 kilometers. And it was, hot. And this heat question also is something that the company was unwilling to actually discuss or deal with. Air conditioning was finally introduced in KGF only in the 1930s. The excuses that were given for the company to not provide certain kinds of facilities was that natives are used to working in very high temperatures, and therefore they can tolerate higher temperatures. They might even actually like higher temperatures, and so on. So, there is this entire discourse that was built around what was the native body and what the tolerance levels of the native body were compared to for example, the European, many of European bodies. As you can see in this image itself, the so-called native laborer is practically naked, while the European is fully dressed and is supervising some operation. So the kinds of facilities that were offered to these workers were kept to the very bare minimum. But to come more directly to the question of why such hostility to a registration system, let me also explain two or three aspects, other aspects of life in KGF. Although they earned a respectable wage, they earned something like between 23 and 25 rupees a month, which was not too bad a wage. And some of them went up, if they were maestries and so on, went up to about 50 rupees a month. They were heavily indebted. So about 80% of workers in this region were heavily indebted. And it need not surprise us that along with the workers who came to KGF from different parts of, primarily from Tamil Nadu, there were also a flock of Marwari moneylenders. The Marwaris set themselves up as pawnbrokers and as moneylenders almost as soon as the workers themselves had settled in this region. Now, why I raise the question of the Marwari moneylender is, of course, because they kept their accounts in their own languages. They were able to negotiate all kinds of rates of interest, which sometimes the laborers were themselves not aware of. And they therefore demanded all kinds of, dues. They also had managed to persuade John Taylor and Sons to allow them to attach the salaries of workers if they were heavily indebted. So the workers' wages would directly be attached by the moneylender if the person had actually fallen into very grave debt. In such a system, you can imagine that there was a complete complicity between the company and the moneylender itself. And the moneylender was obviously both feared and, of course, was a very necessary element of the economic environment in that region. Sometimes the worker was indebted up to 5 or 6 times his monthly salary. And by the way, I say his because no work underground, no women were allowed underground. There was no work for women in KGF as such. But migration to KGF was familial. Now, this is another very interesting, we have heard so much of late about North-South divide. But one of the interesting things about the South is that migration is largely familial. It is not single male migration. So even to KGF, the migration was familial. There were women there were children, and so on and so forth, and they all lived in these mines, coolie lines. But there were very few opportunities for employment for women. If I can do a small aside, which is related to the filmmaking effort that I made. I was, of course, one of the few women who had gone underground. But that apart, the women from the families of the miners had never seen the underground, not even as visitors. So my film actually brought to them an insight, a view of the underground that for years they had not known the kinds of conditions in which their own men had been working. Yeah, so that is, I'm coming back to the question of the relationship between the Marwari and the worker. There was a sort of a very tense relationship because the Marwari had certain inscrutable ways of maintaining his accounts, and very often the worker was relatively illiterate, and therefore, there are various ways in which the debts were recovered. Secondly, and this is relevant to what I just showed you of the Mysore Criminal Tribes Act, fingerprinting was also a way that was introduced in order to identify the criminal tribes. So fingerprinting is associated very strongly, therefore, with ideas of criminality, which, as I said, in Mysore was only applicable to the KGF area. No, so what I'm suggesting to you is the work was not only dangerous, given the kinds of conditions in which people were working, but also that dangerous labor was also considered criminal, verging on criminality. When I say dangerous worker, let me also say in passing, although this is something I've discussed in some detail in my book, that there were a very large number of accidents, and of course, meticulous records were maintained about these accidents. But the causes for the accidents were usually attributed to workers themselves. So workers were careless, workers were working underground with very little light, workers were issued at that time not the mining helmets that you can see here with the lamp shining, but they were issued candles, and the candles had to be used underground to light up the surface. I think in this image also you can sort of see the candle, if I'm not mistaken, or at least the light here is being shed by the candles. But workers would very frequently try to save up on the use of candles for future use in their own homes. So, it became a reason to blame the workers for the kinds of accidents. He slipped, they're falling down shafts about 200 feet and dying. But it's all their own fault because they're careless, they are trying to save on the candles, they're trying to reuse the candles. So under the Mysore Mining Act, which I spoke to you about, the regulations, one of the things that they introduced were pink stearine candles in order to identify them as, company property and to distinguish them from other candles so that they need not be, used in homes, and people who did use them could be penalized or fined. It is no surprise, therefore, if I can cite another wonderful Tamil saying from that region, Keele ponal ponam, mele vandal panam. That is, if you go down, there's every likelihood that you will turn into a corpse. But if you come up, there is money. So every day was a challenge. Would you come up as a corpse or as someone who survived to collect a wage? And that was a very common thing that was, said in this area. So this is, there was full understanding of the dangers of work in this area. There was also full understanding of the kinds of restraints and, surveillance measures that were being imposed on workers in this area. But I do want to say that KGF did spell freedom from many other kinds of oppression. So, the Mirasidars and their forms of oppression were certainly something which did not apply in this region. There was also a system of issuing what were called mines out, which meant that if there was some misdemeanor, a worker could be said to have been issued a mines out notice, which meant he could not hereafter be employed in that particular mines. Or there could be a state out notice, which meant that you had to leave the state altogether. The mines out was actually a useful thing because mines out meant you could find employment somehow or the other with another contractor in another mine. And this is useful to understand the opposition that I am describing to the registration system. And then there were these physical circumstances. The workers who actually had to live in very tiny, what are called tatti huts. And when M.A. Srinivasan was sent there to investigate the conditions of labor following this very major strike, he said they are called aeroplane huts because they fly away in a good wind. This is actually a very entertaining person whom I interviewed for my film called Devanbu, who actually talks about these 30 huts.
This is camp. Camp is not a camp. சும்மா டென்ட் அடிக்கிறது தானே இது. இங்கே தங்கங்குதுனாக்கா அந்த வீடெல்லாம் பிரிச்சிருவான், இந்த லைனெல்லாம் பிரிச்சிருவான். இது கேம்ப் மாதிரி. அப்படி கேம்ப்னு வச்சு தான் அந்த வீடுங்களை அடிச்சு கொடுத்தான். தட்டி வீடு, 8 அடி தட்டி வீடு. அன்னைக்கு இது நான் கொஞ்சம் பெருசாக பண்ணேன். இந்த சீட்டு அடிக்கும்போது பெருசாக பண்ணேன். 8 அடி இன்னும் இவ்வளோ நேரம் இத்தனை பேர் நிற்க முடியாது. இந்த கிச்சனுக்கு நான் போனதே கிடையாது அந்த தட்டி இருக்கும்போது.
The flimsy huts, sometimes called aeroplane huts, since they flew away in a good breeze.
So, these 30 huts were also vulnerable because they would be periodically dug up by various kinds of gangs, the rat gang, the prickly pear gang, the incinerator gang. If there was any hint of an epidemic, then these houses would be easily destroyed. And when M.A. Srinivasan went to this area, as I said, in 1930 to do his investigations, he was told the reason we have these very flimsy huts is so that they can easily be torn down should there be an epidemic. So Srinivasan says, at this rate, you should have people living under the trees. Why bother to even build anything for them? So, it was clearly exposing the kinds of limits to which John Taylor was willing to invest in decent facilities for the workers themselves. Despite this, the working class of KGF was very stable. Now, working class historians always look to see what is the commitment of the worker to the area. Are they stable in terms of staying more than 10, 15, 20 years? And here there were people, especially those who participated in this particular strike, who said, we've been here for 30 to 40 years. There have been 2 generations of workers in this area. Why then did they want to pull up the roots and leave at the threat of this particular registration system? As I said, the more interesting thing was, how did these workers mobilize without any leaders? There was no leadership. There was no obvious leadership here. Most of the communication was happening through what I described as these anonymous notices. And anonymity has its uses in a place like this, because it becomes difficult to pin the blame on any particular kind of source. So there were all these anonymous notices which were circling. And if we had to think of the proximate cause, of course, the proximate cause was the Workmen's Compensation Act, which, as I said, required identifying workers. And the company asked for not 1 but 15 sets of fingerprints, in addition to the medical examination. And when Srinivasan did his very exhaustive study of labor in KGF in 1930, following the strike, he discovered to his amazement that the most important occupational illness of the area, miner's phthisis or silicosis, was not included as one of the compensatable diseases under this act. And they deliberately avoided including miner's phthisis, even though miner's phthisis was actually included in the South African mines, which is the comparable mines, right? He was absolutely taken aback, and silicosis was not compensated till well into the 30s. So the mines were actually literally getting away with doing very little for workers and trying to escape their responsibilities to the workers. And in fact, Ralph Nye, who was one of the managing directors and also a member of the Legislative Assembly, said that, if you insist that we compensate workers for miner's phthisis, we will have to close shop and leave. That was the threat, that, you cannot force us to actually compensate such a widespread disease, which is an occupational hazard like no other, because you're constantly breathing the dust and so on. The Compensation Act, as I said, therefore, did not list miner's phthisis. As I said at the outset, by April 1930, 7,000 had given their fingerprints. Then the notice that was stuck to the rock told them they should not give these fingerprints to the company. And they also advised them, take the rice ration, which comes around the 7th or 8th of the month, and keep away from work until some big man, that is to say from the company or from the state, comes to intervene and solve this particular problem. I interviewed one member, an old congressman called Bafna, who who was able to recall.
In 1930, the company's decision to register the fingerprints of all miners led to the first general strike at KGF. 18,000 miners struck work for 21 days and even started leaving the area, forcing the company to withdraw its plans.
The only thing I can remember is that my father and one Miss Rajgopal Rao came with a huge crowd. They said that we are only laborers, we are not your prisoners, you see. Why do you want our fingerprints? After all, you are paying at the time, they were giving only 6 annas or 8 annas per day. Now you want to make us slaves for you. See that we don't want to do the work. We don't want to put it. And the management wanted that they should put the fingers. So on that.
So he basically says that's why the strike started, because they did not want to see themselves as criminals. They felt there was no reason to be enslaved on the mines. So they had a very clear picture of what work meant and what it did not mean, that it did not mean committing yourself to this kind of bondage, a fresh form of bondage in this area. Incidentally, he was the son of a Marwari moneylender before he became a congressman. He became a congressman, but his father was a moneylender. So he was very much somebody who realized and told us so that even the moneylenders and the Marwaris were very anxious that the strike should not continue. So they were very keen that the government intervene to solve this problem. Incidentally, I hope you all noticed that the strike broke out on the same day that Gandhiji broke the salt law. That was a serendipitous discovery when I was looking at the Hindu newspaper in Chennai, and I discovered that it was exactly on those days. And I'll come back to, what the nationalist question is really towards the end of this talk. The workers demanded a return of their fingerprints. And they also wanted to return the registration discs that they had been issued by the company. So they did not want any element that would tie them down in any way to particular mines. And in fact, the Mysore government itself, which sends urgently this bureaucrat called Ramanathan to the area to investigate what is the problem and why are these people so agitated, he says, is it even legal to ask for this kind of fingerprinting? I mean, this is like outrageous to be able to ask for this much fingerprinting. And things got so bad over the period of few days that Ramanathan himself supervised the destruction of these 7,000 fingerprints with 2,000 workers actually watching him. It was really something that was discovered to be something quite important to the Mysore government as well, because of course the royalties paid by the John Taylor and Sons were quite substantial and could not be ignored. But A.V. Ramanathan's presence did not, in fact, actually put an end to the strike, nor did the destruction of those fingerprints actually allay the fears of the workers themselves. These were the demands of the workers on April 12th, 1930, which was just a few days after the announcement of the strike was made. This demand leaflet had to be printed in Bangalore because no KGF printer would accept to print it out of sheer fear. And by this time, the number of demands has clearly grown. They are asking for the grant of hospital and sick pay, service money to contract laborers, full strike pay, contract labor to be on the same footing as company labor for attendance bonus, a recognition of their labor representatives, and importantly, abolition of employment office in any form. They did not want to have such an office as an employment office or a central registry or any of these kinds of words to be used for the processes which the company wanted to actually introduce. And the threat was that if these demands are not met, pay the salaries that we are owed so that we can go home. And they were very firm and clear about this. Now, there are 2 or 3 things that we must note about this list of demands. One is, of course, that unlike what we might imagine, that there was a big gulf between those who were company workers and those who were actually the contract workers. There was here a unique kind of solidarity that one has not witnessed previous to this episode. They were clear that the threat of registry was a threat to all workers, not just to company or to contract workers. Of course, contract workers actually exploited the fact that they were undetected when they went from mine to mine to work for different contractors. And as I said to you, there was a lot of self-exploitation. There were people who would work one shift in one mine and work for another contractor on another shift in another mine. And he would not be detected because there was no system of this registration of discs and so on at that time. So these were advantages and loopholes that were exploited very imaginatively and creatively by workers themselves. So naturally, they did not want to see an end to it, or they did not want to see in place a system which would put them in the category of being criminals themselves, in terms of their fingerprints being collected, putting them in a space where you are unaware of what the consequences of giving your fingerprints might be. And finally, they did not want to lose that small kind of capacity for exploiting the loopholes in a system which did not sort of require them to identify themselves so strictly. This question becomes very important to us in our times, if you don't mind me making a direct parallel with our times. We are constantly asked by our state to identify ourselves, provide what they call know your customer documents over and over and over again, at the same time as the state is becoming more and more and more inscrutable, more and less transparent, as it were, to us. So, this historical sort of hostility to forms of identification are actually quite important and interesting to us as forms of resistance against this insistence on identification as well. Don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that KGF was unutterably a torture for workers. As I said, and in fact I have a whole chapter in my book that discusses it, the money wage was definitely a source of great value, of great liberation, rather than the extra economic coercion that they might have experienced back in their villages, where they were forced to perform labor for free and so on and so forth, or they were paid in kind in ways that they could not assess whether it was fair. Even though there was no organized movement at this time in KGF, there was a fair degree of a sense that they were actually being paid reasonable wages. And there was also a sense of cultural self-definition. I want to spend 2 or 3 minutes just discussing this, even though it's not necessarily relevant to our discussion of this particular strike. For example, in 1907, Ayodhyadas Panditer, who was the founder of South Indian Buddhism in the Chennai, Madras region, actually comes to KGF and establishes a center for South Indian Buddhism there. And a very important journal called Tamiran is established in KGF. So it was earlier coming out in Madras, and now it is coming out from the Siddhartha Press in KGF. It is a sign of how important South Indian Buddhism had become in the KGF region, that the 21 census and the 31 census record something like 20 to 30,000 Buddhists in the area. Of course, it is a source of new self-definition, leaving aside, because most of those who came from the Tamil region were Adi Dravidas, or people who were from extremely oppressed castes. So Buddhism did imagine this is like decades before Ambedkar's famous conversion to Buddhism, that the South Indian Buddhism is taking such a strong root in the KGF area. It is also interesting, or equally interesting, I should say, that this South Indian Buddhism in some ways tapers off and almost vanishes by about the 1940s. So we don't have too much of a large presence of Buddhists declaring themselves Buddhists by the 41 census. But in any case, at this time, 20s and 30s, there is quite a large presence of the South Indian Buddhists. There are traveling monks from Sri Lanka and so on to this region. There is a sense of self-worth which is attached to the fact there is both a certain kind of pride in the kinds of everyday life that you engage with. So, for example, there's a lot of I have looked at some of these for my work. There were lots of popular songs which were in printed and circulated in chapbooks, which actually describe pride in beef eating, saying, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with eating meat? Or such? Even the white man eats beef. So there is a certain kind of connection that is being made with, the fact that even the people who actually rule us are people who engage in these kinds of food habits. So there is a sense of, and of course they were well dressed in this area. So if you look at the pictures of the workers, even as early as 1918, 20, and so on, you will see them sitting in rows, sometimes in three-piece suits. They might even have been rented suits, but whatever it is, this was a very far cry from this tousle-haired Parayan, who would have been the description that would have been in the, Edward Thurston's Castes and Tribes in southern India and so on. So there is a certain new sense of self-worth that is emerging as a consequence of the money wage, as a consequence of work in the mines, which actually allows you to be able to afford these new kinds of pleasures and these new forms of sartorial assertion, if you like. Very important, this three-piece suit. As you know, Ambedkar famously never relinquished his three-piece suit, in direct and in obvious contrast to someone like Gandhi, who actually shed his clothing in order to be one with the peasantry. So there are different kinds of movements which are sort of coming together at this time. But and when there is even a report, a police report about Periyar actually traveling from the Tamil region to come to Bangarpet, Jolarpet, sorry, and he is, stopped there, partly because the Adi Dravidas felt that his call to ask people not to wear milk clothing, not to, and especially women, not to clothe themselves in the upper half of their bodies, was actually something shameful and something that they had already given up, and something they would not agree with Periyar about. So there was even critique of the Dravidian movement in the kinds of actions of these workers here. It was only in KGF that there was opposition to this film. This is, of course, a little later, in 1942, that there is opposition to the film called Nandanar, in which Nandanar is actually disgraced by the priests of the Chidambaram temple being called Paraya and so on and so forth. And they said that this word should not be used because since 1921, we no longer use this kind of word for self-referencing, and the word that is been officially accepted to describe us is Adi Dravida. So there was actual protests that broke out, and the film had to be withdrawn from circulation in KGF. I'm saying all this because obviously it was a location where new forms of self-definition were emerging as a consequence of both political influences and also, as I said, a consequence of the fact that there was this money wage. So there was no question of a return to certain forms of extra economic coercion, which they felt was what was implied in the collection of the fingerprints. So here is the power of anonymity, because here you have another anonymous notice which says, look, there was one man who had given his finger impressions at Balaghat mines. He died, and when the deceased wife demanded money, the company told her, see, your husband gave his thumb impressions for 1,000 rupees and he owes us 1,000 rupees. Why should he have signed? Did we ask him to sign? And so forth. So the company threatens us like this. So, who knows what the company will do with these fingerprints? They can actually foist a whole new set of demands on you, just like the Marwadi does. So, why add to your troubles and why add to making yourself indistinguishable from the criminal tribes who are already under such strict surveillance? So that is definitely something that they did not wish. The power of anonymity is also quite, as I said, the sense of humor of the KGF workers is actually something quite admirable. So there were notices which came out in the name of Dandasur Dadiraman, which is like taking the, inverting the stereotype, as it were. The stereotype being, you're a lazy layabout. And okay, let's accept that name. Let's be the lazy layabout and sign our notices in the name of this Dadiraman, which is just like, somebody who eats and does not work. And, ask people to come out and not cooperate with the government. Sorry, not the government, but not cooperate with the company in what they wish to do in placing us in this new form of slavery. So the reluctance to relinquish certain kinds of privileges, especially the privileges of, moving between mines, etc., the mining discs would have put an end to this. And this is clearly something they did not want to participate in. So the company had to publicly destroy the fingerprints, as I have already mentioned, that they had already collected. They had to take back the mining discs, which allowed, as I said, workers some leeway in manipulating the system, and a very harsh system at that. And therefore, the workers come back to work about 21 days later, but not before the state government had taken grave notice of the difficulties that had beset KGF and had sent the Diwan himself. The Diwan Mirza Ismail comes to KGF almost in the role of a labor commissioner. There was no labor commissioner in Mysore at that time. Interestingly enough, he refuses the hospitality of the mining company. He says, I want to stay independent in this particular inquiry. I want to hear what the workers have to say for the reasons for their opposition to the system. And therefore, he refuses the hospitality of the John Taylor and Sons. He conducts his inquiry, and of course, he is also taken aback at the kinds of conditions which prevail. And that's what leads him to appoint the M.A. Srinivasan committee to inquire in detail into labor in KGF and the kinds of, imagine, the company had been functioning for well over 50 years without the state government even having a good sense. Of course, every year you have to report to the Department of Industries and Commerce. There is no question about it. But as we all know, the reporting can be gravely biased, because the people who report and the factory inspectors and so on and so forth will all be in the hands of the company itself. So there was no knowledge, even among the higher echelons of the government, of the kinds of conditions that prevailed in KGF and the kinds of conditions against which these workers were so strongly opposed. It took Diwan Mirza Ismail's visit to KGF to actually turn the tide, as it were, to reassure the workers that the state government was actually on their side, and to persuade them, therefore, to return to work as early as possible. So 21 days later, they are back at work. What does this tell us? I come now to the end of what I have to say today. It tells us that this struggle, this strike, was really not about it was not about wages. It was not really, strictly speaking, even about working conditions. But it was about dignity. It was about dignity and self-worth, which workers were not willing to sacrifice in order to continue to work in these mines. This is an extraordinary occasion because, we do not have too many examples of workers striking for something other than conditions of work and wages and so on. Of course, as you know from the list that they actually submitted to the government, to the company, they had added many things. They had asked for strike pay, they had asked for equalization between contract and company workers and so on and so forth. But that was another kind of revelation as well, this new kind of solidarity that was forged between two sets of workers who otherwise would have been, there would have been some tension between the more privileged company workers and the less privileged contract workers. But here they are, fighting side by side for their rights equally, and at this moment of vulnerability. And they realize also the power of this unified protest. They also realize the power of not having a leader, as it were. the company was really anxious about who would mediate with these workers who appeared to be completely solid, completely in unison in terms of their opposition, but never had a clear-cut leadership. In fact, we don't hear names at all of who actually participated in writing, for example, these anonymous notices or getting the pamphlet published in Bangalore. We don't have any information about this at all. Because the sources do not tell us that any one person was identified. The company tried to say we need to have someone who represents the workers, otherwise we cannot settle this issue. And the government says, well, you are the ones who had such a strict mining regulation that you did not allow any kind of representation of workers to actually emerge. So who are you to complain that there is now nobody to navigate or to represent these workers? So this is a very interesting moment precisely because there is no clear-cut leadership and there is no clear-cut representational force such as labor leaders and so on. The Congress was anxious to jump in and come to this area but had been disallowed. The communists were waiting in the wings and eventually would make their mark by the 1940s. But at this moment that we are talking about, the strike was more or less entirely run by workers themselves. And they were very clear that they wanted to avoid bondage. So one of the anonymous notices says, for example, when we have worked for 15, 20, 40 years, this indignity is unacceptable. Because, as I said, they had already escaped the indignities of bondage in the countryside, and they had exchanged the oppressions of the countryside for the exploitation of the mines, but they were certainly not going to subject themselves to a new form of oppression. And this is what the district magistrate of the area had to assure Dhanapal, who was a contractor. You can see that the law is actually coming down on the side of the workers themselves. The sign of left thumb impressions given by them in the identification ticket does not bind them in law to the company in any way. That is, it does not prevent them changing their employment from the company to another employer at their will and pleasure, and does not give the company any right to get them back to work against their will. So it had to make this very clear that there is no legal standing for this collection of registration of fingerprints. And in any case, the fingerprints had been publicly destroyed in the presence of workers themselves. We also have a series of actions by members of the community, including women and in some cases even children, preventing those who wanted to go back to work in dribs and drabs through the course of the strike, preventing them from entering the mines and breaking that solidarity. But it was all done in a very non-violent way. So this is the other aspect of this strike that is very striking, that it was a non-violent strike. There was no, there had been violence, for example, in 1907, 10, 11, 12, and so on, against these Punjabi watchmen, because they were obviously seen as mini oppressors of their own kind. The watchmen were all from Punjab, all Hindi speakers and so on and so forth. So was that hostility to these watchmen. But here you have a new kind of solidarity emerging, and where the entire community is actually saying we will not tolerate and accept this kind of strike breaking by anybody who's deluded into thinking that they will have a good life under such conditions that the company is instituting. Let me return to the question of the national scene. As I said, it was a completely serendipitous discovery. The Hindu paper, by the way, I should say this for those of you who may not be aware, had very, very consistent reporting on labor strikes throughout its existence, from as early as the 1880s. It's a treasure trove of information on, in terms of meticulously following up various kinds of labor issues that happened in different parts of the country. And in this case, KGF was at the center of its regular daily reportage, and it became a very important source for my own work. But as I said, when I was turning the pages for the film, I saw this entry which said that Gandhiji breaks the salt law. What was the link between the national movement, which was no doubt a big wave, the non-cooperation movement of this time in this area? None at all. There was no trace of any kind of nationalist, sloganeering or any hint of nationalist mobilization. And as many historians, including some Sumit Sarkar, have actually said about non-cooperation, it did not see the red of the proletariat. The proletariat remained at a distance from non-cooperation throughout the country, and KGF was no exception to this. So these disjunct events, the breaking of the salt law and the massive sort of rise of the non-cooperation movement in various parts of India, equally historic, this strike, which produces new solidarities, is completely successful in terms of demanding from the company and from the government a certain kind of attention and focus on what the worker was enduring in this 75 square mile area. This was a true achievement, as much of an achievement as what the nationalists achieved through the non-cooperation in other parts of the country. But the interesting thing is that the Kannada newspaper, Vishwa Karnataka, which is one of the papers which also covered labor issues in exhaustive detail, particularly when it involved the people who were associated with the paper, did not cover the KGF strike. Nor did, and this is perhaps even more surprising and more intriguing, the Tamarin. The Tamarin did not have more than one little entry which said that the workers had gone on strike. Did not cover the strike. Tamarin was devoted to its cause, which was to redefine workers in this new space, anti-Brahmanism, but also in South Indian Buddhism, in a way that completely ignores the most significant thing that is happening in the neighborhood of that press and that newspaper. I leave you with that enigmatic detail and leave you with this image as well, to argue that there was a very particular conception of the world which was remarkable, that is by the workers, which was remarkable for being well organized, for being non-violent, and for producing, as I said, this new kind of solidarity, not only between company and contract labor, but also between members of the community as a whole. Thank you very much.
I'm very intrigued by the what you say about the government, the state, actually ruling against the company. Because in most cases, the corporates and they were not corporates in those days, but the equivalent of corporates, and the ruling parties were in collusion against the workers. So this, I thought, was quite unusual.
A few months ago, I found out that the Cornish miners that were brought from Cornwall to KGF to help out in this whole process, it was very random. I found that they've produced a new music album by talking to people that are that were ancestors that worked in the KGF mines, and similarly, people that also worked in the KGF mines but were Cornish descent. So something that I kept thinking about throughout your talk was, were the Cornish miners ever in the picture in terms of solidarity? I'm assuming they probably were contracted differently, or probably like permanent labor of companies. But I was wondering if they ever played a role in the solidarity picture for the workers that were on strike.
Okay, let me answer these two questions. The first is actually not that surprising, because it is the most important enterprise in Mysore. So if it shuts down for any reason, and it looked like the workers were determined to go away from the area, then it would have been a very damaging for the Mysore government itself. Here again, if I get let me take this opportunity to tell you yet another funny kind of aphorism that M.A. Srinivasan heard when he went on his investigation in KGF. One of the workers told him, "Enna sir, unga Mysore government வள்ளக்காரனுக்கு போய் அந்த இது தங்கத்தை கொடுத்து Irumbe Nonra, which means that, he's gone and given the gold to the white man and is digging for iron. This was the time when, of course, Visvesvaraya was actually making the plea to set up his iron and steel industry. So, there was acute awareness of how important this mineral resource was, how it was being mined, the royalties that are coming to the state government, and so on and so forth, that at any cost you could not shut it down. So there was obviously attention paid to this particular conjuncture, which appeared to be threatening the very continuance of the mines. To replace 18,000 workers would not have been an easy joke at all. Regarding the Cornish miners, I have not mentioned all this because there's far too much to be talked about in terms of how labor was mobilized from different parts of the country, South India, and also from other parts of the world. The Cornish tin miners were, of course, invited for the kinds of skills they had in tin mining. They did perform their labors in KGF. Many of them were also buried there. There were Italian miners as well who were, there were, separate camps for Italian miners. And of course, there were the British themselves. In addition to a very solid layer of Anglo-Indian workers in this area, who were primarily involved with the railways and with the mine mills as such. Now, all these groups were, of course, kept separate by one very important thing, and that was their wages. The white man earned something like 7 times the wages that were paid to Indian workers, even for the same job. And when the question of, accidents came up, and they said they're so careless, they don't know how to drive these bundis and so on and so forth, and the answer will be to simply employ Europeans everywhere. They realize they cannot employ Europeans everywhere because that would mean paying out that kind of wage. So the chances of solidarity between these different groups was actually very small. I certainly, in my research, have not encountered any kind of such solidarity that was expressed by the expatriate miners who were resident in KGF. There may have been some stray, minister or missionary or something like that, but even that, I did not come across any such reference. As I said, Tamarin is completely silent. So, who knows who else was completely silent about this set of events. So yeah, I don't know that there was active support. It could be that there are some sources which claim that.
You'd mentioned that there were women and children who tried to stop people going back to work or to break the strike. How did they do that?
They actually blocked the entrance to the shafts. They literally stood in front of the shafts and prevented people from entering the shafts. So it was a very physical, and obviously women and children means they won't get attacked or, in the same way that perhaps if it had been only men. But I don't think there were black legs, really speaking, like you had in other industrial strikes, where companies would try to employ certain kinds of black legs, people who were from a different geographical area coming to. These were people who were mine workers themselves and who were trying to return to work. So it was persuasion, I suppose, more than anything else.
Can I speak? Yes. Yeah, why do you think the Tamarin kept quiet? I would think they would have been the most vociferous.
Why did they?
The Tamarin, why did they remain silent?
I have no idea.
I would imagine they would be the most vociferous, right?
Yes, but Tamarin had its own agenda. It was like devoted to this whole unpacking Brahmanism and the kind of attack on Brahmanism as the single most oppressive element in their life worlds and so on. So yes, it is surprising, but they did not in fact report on this. As a matter of fact, I don't think they reported on any of the subsequent strikes either in 42, 45. There were very big strikes that happened in those days.
Was there a particular reason most of the workers were of Tamil origin and not Karnatakas or from other neighboring states?
Yes, the reason is, well, first of all, there is this geographical location. KGF is actually at the cusp of three language regions: the Andhra region, the Tamil region, and the Kannada region. Um, Kannadiga, South Mysore had a sort of agrarian structure that was dominated by the peasantry, ownership of small areas of land, like up to 5 acres and so on and so forth. So it was a very self-sufficient in terms of occupation. There wasn't the kind of push off the land that was happening in places like North Arcot, Salem, and Chingalpat, which were these dry regions which experienced extremely long spells of dry, weather, and which required people to go out to work, and also people who wanted to escape, as I said, from the kinds of indignities to which they had been subjected by the mirasidars of that area. So the company seems to have very consciously recruited from these regions, which were where the push factor was greater than the pull factor. And of course, later on, when KGF was established as a place where you could earn money and you could, perhaps even save something and so on and so forth, it had its own attraction. So there was a pull factor there as well. So many of my informants, for example, told me how that in order to get a job in the mines, you had to be a certain height and a certain weight, and of course you had to be a certain age. And they would weigh themselves down with stones in their pockets to cross that weight barrier and things like that. So they really wanted to get work in the mines. That same push was not seen in the Mysore region because of the agrarian structure, because there was land and there were small, peasants who were tilling their land and so on. The push happens much, much later, like say in the 50s, when Karnataka state is formed, and there is a push from the northern districts, which are again the drier districts and so on. More or less all industrial labor was dominated by Tamilians at this time, even in Bangalore and in Bhadravati. So wherever there was industrial labor, it was dominated by Tamilians.
Where did all the gold go? It did go to England, did it? Or
It
where
was
did
sold
it
in
end up?
international markets, yeah.
Okay. And the profits, and also, what were the profits of the company?
Profits were enormous. I mean, but as I said, the only thing Mysore got out of it were the royalties, and even those were quite high, which was why, so obviously the profits were even much, much greater. The British also recognized that this is a waning asset. So they recognize then, by the 40s and so on, there'll be many areas that can no longer provide the kinds of, returns for the kind of depth to which the mines had actually gone. So they were slowly, in any case, trying to withdraw from very deep mining by the 40s and it so happened that India got independence, and then, in any case, the mines shifted over to the state government and finally to the central government.
Janaki, I'm really intrigued by this leaderless, almost self-organized, sui generis movement that seems to have been completely isolated even from the main ideological currents of the time, whether it is the anti-Brahmin movement, the national movement, or even the communist movement. And it just seems to have sprung up, leaderless, anonymous, and I'm not sure that I've come across anything like this. So do you have any explanation for this?
Yeah, well, I can only say, as I've said, I hope throughout what I have spoken so far, that there was a very strong investment in a question of dignity, and there is a threshold below which you will not go. You'll put up with so much, but there'll be a threshold below which you will not go. You will not allow yourself to be bonded all over again. Who knows to what use the company will put it. This was the nature of the anonymous messages, right? So that uncertainty of what, negative consequences would ensue from actually having these fingerprints and these forms of identification with the company, which had not distinguished itself by taking care of the workers in any way, was something that, who knows if they would have used it to actually escape from whatever provisions of the Workmen's Compensation Act. At least one of the anonymous notices seemed to suggest that, right? It was turning the tables on the workers and saying, look, you've signed and you actually owe me 1,000 rupees, not, not that I owe you any money. So there was a very strong conception of protecting themselves against possible further exploitation. That's the only explanation I can give, and that it is a really unusual strike for that reason, because it is really about dignity and self-worth, and it's really not about any small, wage increase or... Leaderless because they did not allow the leaders to come in, so obviously, I mean, I'm assuming that organs like the Tamarin and whatever other kinds of newspapers were circulating in the area. There were, as I told you, there's very lively chapbook tradition which was talking about life in the mines and celebrating, for example, the thief and so on and so forth. So there was a whole subculture there which was very self-conscious, very sort of entrenched in an understanding of the world and the relationships without any illusions. It's not that they thought there were any illusions that the company is going to work on their behalf. It was also a way, I suppose, of putting pressure on the state to intervene. So, yeah. So it is unusual. I mean, it is, as they themselves said, they were at a loss because they had nobody to negotiate with. And that was all their own fault.
Considering that the government later, the same Mysore Karnataka government, had the foresight to put a BEML because the gold was diminishing.
Yeah.
Why did they take 21 days and show so much apathy before settling this strike?
Okay, let's separate BML because BML is an Indian government establishment and it happens much, much later. It's in the post-independence period. It doesn't happen because of any relationship to KGF at all. BML is located in that area because there is land and there is, so there's no link whatsoever between KGF and BML. Why did they take so long? They did not take long. They had first tried to intervene by sending their minister, A.V. Ramanathan. He came first, and he was the one who supervised the destruction of the fingerprints in the presence of workers themselves. That did not succeed, and that's why they had to actually send the highest person in that. Nothing less than the Diwan actually visits KGF in order to intervene. So, and there was no labor commissioner, as I said, at this time. So there was obviously a great sense of crisis. I am sure that the company itself invited the Diwan to come and settle because they felt they had completely lost their authority in the area and they needed somebody to restore their sense of authority. As I said, these are all speculations on the basis of what actually comes out of this exchange. But yeah, that's my sense of it.
Did the agrarian families...
I think that Raman has a question for a long time. Sorry. No, they need the mic.
Fascinating, Janaki. Fascinating presentation. I have just a few observations to make. One is, if you look at the social composition of the KGF workforce, besides, of course, a predominantly Tamil labor force, there were also Malayalis, Telugus, and Punjabis, as you put it. This 1930 working class uprising, was it predominantly Tamil? Was it purely contractual, or did the company workers also join? What about the Kanganis who recruited these contract workers? Were they also part of the struggle? That's one. And number two, you seem to suggest that it's essentially self-dignity and self-esteem rather than economic. But if you look at the family budgets of that time, 1930, a family budget was conducted. It clearly suggests that, indebtedness was very, very high, as you also seem to indicate. I mean, apart from food, the other source, major sort of element of the income was repaying of loans, from the Marwadis and others. So given that, would you suggest that there were not other factors itself also may have shaped this, what you call spontaneous. Was it really spontaneous? Because I gather that 1928, there was some attempt to form some kind of a cultural organization, Adi Dravida cultural organization within KGF. Could that not have been a prelude to this kind of thing?
Well, let me again repeat that, of course, both company and contract labor were involved in the strike. I said that several times. So it was a unique form of solidarity that occurred, that was forged at this moment. I don't think that we should attribute the distress to purely economic concerns, because that was the condition of their work in this area at this time in any case, that they were indebted. That is what the Srinivasan report actually discovered. Up to 80% of workers in that area were indebted. That was the condition of their lives there. They could not manage without some form of debt. And even as they said, even someone who was able to accumulate a little bit of money was able to become a moneylender himself. So money lending was something that many people engaged in, not just the Marwadis, but also merchants and various others, very well-paid workers and so on. Did the Mestris join? Yes, they did, because the Mestris and the Kanganis and so on, because it was their people who were insisting on going back to the villages and refusing to participate in this. So there was concern, there was anxiety on the part of people like the Mestris and the Kanganis and so on and so forth. But I don't think that there was, I don't think that it can be reduced, I mean, at least this moment can be reduced to merely economic distress. I think that it definitely had, it was a flashpoint, as I said. It was just that tipping point of thus far and no more, that kind of thing. And it is a very conjunctural event. I actually don't agree with you that it was a long time in the making. There may have been, there not just may have been, there were cultural organizations at work, not just amongst the Adi Dravidas, but also, amongst those who were converting to Christianity, those who were reformed Hindus. There were all kinds of movements which were affirming the cultural specificity of people who had settled in this area. Were they only Tamils? No, of course not. But the Tamils were the dominant force. And, most of the communications that are coming in the anonymous notes are in Tamil. So clearly they have played a very large role in organizing and in sustaining the strike. Punjabi watchmen would, I think, not have. I mean, they would have been more loyal to the company. Europeans had their own sense of, loyalty. And Malayalis, who were mainly in the carpentry and that sort of work, they certainly participated with these workers in opposing the registration system. So there was all kinds of solidarities emerging and some sort of cleavages as well, but that didn't prevent people from, striking till they achieved their end. Let's put it like that. This is a very unusual strike because it actually achieved what it wanted to achieve. Okay, I think there's a question here from this young person here.
So I just wanted to know what happened to the agrarian families that were living in this region when the land was given to John Taylor and Sons, and also what the impact was on the land from mining and how that in turn impacted the worker.
When the land was acquired for mining, I'm not sure. I don't know but it wouldn't have been a major dislocation because this was a relatively dry area. The state would have acquired the land, of course. But in terms of impact, you're quite right. The impact was quite severe and is to be seen even to the present day, because one of the elements that is used in mining, in the mining process, and in actually extracting gold from the ore is cyanide. So if you visit KGF today, there are it's ringed by what are called cyanide dumps, which actually have high levels of cyanide in the soil in in that detritus of mining, which continues to remain there. There have been some schemes to reforest that and so on and so forth, which have been partially successful. The water sources were therefore obviously contaminated. But all this took a while to unfold. It didn't happen at the time that we are talking about. And certainly the consciousness about environmental damage was not something that was there in the time that we are talking about. It was an extractive industry, and it was something that actually, the consequences, the long-term consequences of it were not envisaged, imagined, or dealt with.
So I think there are 4 more questions, Janki. Do you want to take them together, or we're almost out of time? Okay. So can I ask the 4 of you to quickly ask your question and keep it short so she can have a chance to answer all of your questions?
Hello. My question is that when all the workers came together in like a new sense of solidarity, was there some form of sympathy or empathy or any form of action to help the tribes, or because of the Criminal Tribes Act, was there any change in the status?
You mentioned that the story of KJF is not, when it comes to workers, is not one purely of exploitation, but there was also value created for the workers through the wages. So, do the wages earned by the workers create any sort of economic or social mobility from within the communities? Did it challenge any sort of traditional hierarchies existing there?
I'm curious to know what happened after the state intervened, and did the living and working conditions change, or did it take a long time? Like, were they properly compensated for the health concerns that rose because of their occupation? And what about their housing? Those, instead of those flimsy tents that could be uprooted, did the housing conditions change over time?
I had a question about how these people survived when they were ready to leave, because they were already in debt to the moneylenders. Was there some kind of system among the workers to help each other out? That was one question. The other one was, did the state government not see this as a chance to boot the John Taylor people out and take over the mines?
Okay, so is that the set of questions? Okay, so to answer Ankita first, I did not come across any kind of sense of reference to the criminal tribes as such in the course of the strike. And certainly the Criminal Tribes Act was not repealed till much, much later, till independence actually. So it didn't have any material effect on that set of people at all. So this question of mobility is actually a very interesting one, and please do watch my film if you get a chance, because there is one person who talks about how he makes his way from being a foreigner wage earner to becoming a maestri, which is like among the highest levels of supervisory categories. He happens to be a Malayali. There were many people who made their name and made their way to becoming contractors themselves from being wage laborers. So clearly there were opportunities for new kinds of economic and social mobility. So, economic mobility, to answer your question, but also social mobility, which I've already referred to, in terms of reformed Hinduism or leaving Hinduism altogether and becoming Buddhist, converting to Christianity, etc., etc. Various kinds of such forms of self-definition which happen as a consequence of. So definitely there was opportunity for mobility. Let me remember. Yes, did their conditions improve? Nothing so dramatic, but as I said, for example, John Taylor and Sons was compelled to introduce silicosis rules and to be able to compensate for silicosis by the 1930s. That was definitely an improvement. The housing did in fact improve, but if you speak to workers, as I did for the film, for example, their memory of the biggest change is when the Indian government takes over. For them, the Indian government was the one that actually made the big difference to their working conditions, whether in terms of wages or in terms of protections or in terms of, facilities at work and so on and so forth. So when it became this big public sector undertaking, they were much more privileged than they had ever been in their, previous. But they were also self-conscious of the fact that they were Tamil workers in a predominantly Kannada-speaking region. So that, that slight element of being the outsider was also something that was at play in the tensions between the state government and these workers who lived there. And this comes out, of course, much more strongly in the post-independence period. But yeah, so at least as far as memory of workers goes, and in terms of instituting certain kinds of protections, it's the Indian state that does it. It is not John Taylor and Sons. I mean, as I said, 30s they finally compensate Thesis, but under great pressure, and they also have to intervene on this attachment of wages question as a consequence of this report. So they have to sort of protect people from the the negative impact of Marwaris actually claiming the salaries themselves, wages. Regarding the question that you raised, it was not even a remote possibility for the Indian state to take over that mines, partly because we were under conditions of colonialism at that time, but also the financial investment would have been unbearable for the Mysore state. Would not have been possible, the kind of compensation that you would have had to give for. It was not a possibility. It was not a political possibility at that time. Let's put it like that. So it did not even arise. We were still, even though it was a princely state, it was still under the overall aegis of the British colonial rule. And just, this is again something I cannot include in these lectures, but let me say it since you asked this question. When Mirza and Vishesharaya wanted to establish a car factory in Bangalore, the British did everything in their power to thwart it, because the car factory that would have been established here would have been done in collaboration with Chrysler. And the last thing that the British wanted was an American presence in a market that they had dominated with their British cars. So they did everything in their power to thwart industry, except of this extractive kind, which was already anyway in the hands of a British company.
Once again, thanks to Janaki
Thank
for her
you very
expertise.
much.